Evening, everyone. On behalf of Paraclete Press, welcome to the fourth in our series of live talks on stability, helping us to find inner peace and stillness this Lent, right where we are. My name is Rachel McKendry. I'm the book publicist here at Paraclete, and it's such a pleasure to be with you all again this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Our conversation this evening is with Father Ron Rolheiser. Hi, Father Ron.
Okay, there I am. Now I'm gone.
Thank you so much for joining us, Father Ron. We're so grateful. I know you probably don't need an introduction, but I'm just going to let everyone know who you are. Father Ron Rolheiser is a specialist in the fields of spirituality and systematic theology, and he's a New York Times bestselling author. He writes a regular column that is featured in more than 70 newspapers worldwide. He's the author of many books, including the bestsellers The Holy Longing and Sacred Fire, as well as The Restless Heart, Forgotten Amongst the Lilies, Bruised and Wounded, The Fire Within, and maybe our most appropriate title for tonight, Domestic Monastery, which is now out in this beautiful new paperback form. We're so happy to have it here at Paraclete. A recording of our conversation tonight will be available later on our YouTube channel for anyone who couldn't join us. And everyone who registered will get an email with that link, so please feel free to share it with your friends. Take a minute, if you will, to find the chat bar or the Q&A button. Father Ron's going to teach for a while. We'll have a conversation, and then we will definitely open it up to questions. And there's a lot of people here tonight, but please feel free to submit any questions you might have, and we'll hope to get to everyone before the end of our hour together. These hours fly by. So thank you again to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Father Ron, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. First of all, thank you to Paraclete Press, to Rachel, and to Sister Antonia, who've been coaching me on this. But also thanks to you all for joining in tonight. Tiny little apology, that the French say you should never begin a talk with an apology. When you have a little apology, I had a COVID shot yesterday, and it did a little number on me. So if I have a senior moment, I'm going to blame that. Okay, we're going to talk about stability tonight, and I'd be remiss if I didn't start with some kind of, humorous story on this. But this is it's a terrible joke, but I heard it from a bishop, so I'll be able to tell it to you. But the joke goes this way. There was a couple, and they were in their 90s, and had been married for more than 70 years, and they were filing for divorce. And the judge said, what I don't understand, you've been married for more than 70 years, you're in your 90s, why would you file for divorce now? And the man said, well, actually, we wanted to do it much earlier, but we thought we'd wait until the kids died. Told you it was a bad joke. Okay. I'm going to split the screen here and share the screen. And whoops, I think I did this wrong. Let me do this again. Okay, we're looking at stability. No, I did do it wrong because it's not letting me move it here. Let me do this again. Okay. Patience with me. There we are. Okay. Stability. I want to begin, as this talk goes on, I'm going to identify stability a whole lot with fidelity. Fidelity and stability they're close friends and need each other. So I want to begin with two stories. I call them stories for flavor. So these are, in academic world, they say this is our hermeneutical key. It's like the overture in the opera. It kind of gets the whole thing. The first one is a tribute I once heard to Martin Luther King. When Martin Luther King was buried back in 1968, and actually we just celebrated the anniversary of his death on April the 2nd or whenever it was. And but as people were leaving the cemetery, they were interviewing an older man, and he had tears in his eyes, and the reporter said, what did this man mean to you? what did Martin Luther King, what does this man mean to you? And the old man said, he was faithful. He said, he was a faithful man. He said, he stayed with us. He said, he stayed with us when we weren't worth staying with. And he believed in us when we no longer believed in ourselves. That's quite a tribute. And you're going to see that's ultimately what stability means. He stayed with us when we weren't worth staying with. He kept believing in us when we stopped believing in ourselves. Second story is a story. I have an older brother who's a priest, and he was a missionary for a number of years up in northern Saskatchewan with the Dene tribes and the Cree tribes up there. And he tells this story. He said when he first got there, he said the people were very nice to him, and but he noticed this, that every single time he made an appointment, the people would break it. They'd say, come to the house at 7 o'clock. He'd go to the house, there was nobody home. Or he'd say, come to the rectory at 2 o'clock. They wouldn't come. And first he thought there was some communications problem, but then he realized this is a pattern. And he went to see one of the elders. And he said to the elder, he says, you know, every time I make an appointment, they break it. The elder burst out laughing. He said, of course they're going to break it. He said, the last thing they need is a white man arranging their lives for them. He said, they're going to break it. So my brother said, what should I do? And the elder said, well, don't make an appointment. Just show up at their house. They're nice. They'll talk to you. But he said, this is what you should do. And this is my lesson today. He says, the elder said, stay for a long time and then they'll trust you. Stay with us for a long time and then they'll trust you. He said, right now they're testing you. Are you a missionary or are you a tourist? He said, they've been betrayed by a lot of people and they want to see whether you are a missionary or whether you're a tourist. So we're going to see stability, the importance of staying. Now, stability, there's three aspects here. Stability is a vow made explicitly by monks. So monks, they first made that. Usually religious make vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And the monks make a vow of stability, okay? Then a lot of religious started doing it too. You know, most professed religious, I'm a professed religious, made a vow of poverty, chastity, obedience, except we call it perseverance. The monks call it stability, but it means perseverance. It means I'm not going to leave. I'm not going to leave. Now, it's interesting. That's a vow that's also made explicitly in every marriage. You know what makes marriage stable? If it's adhered to, let's say, until death do us part. So then you have a stable relationship. I vow to you, I'm going to stay with you until death do us part. Now, in religious life and monasteries and marriage, that's made explicitly, okay? But it's a vow, hopefully, we make implicitly in every true friendship we have. Every true friendship can only be predicated on, I will be there for you. Sometimes we'll fight, and sometimes we won't be happy, but I'm going to be there for you. I'm not going to move away the first time we have a fight, and so on. Okay, let's now, stability, I say as a vow to stay within a commitment. Basically, as a vow, stability is the vow to stay within a commitment. And I want to do four things with that. I want to talk about its purpose. Then I want to talk about how it's predicated on forgiveness. Then I want to talk about why our society struggles with it. And then I want to talk briefly about how it's the greatest gift we can give each other. Okay. Now, it's the foundation of all enduring community, religious or secular. Every family, every religious community that endures is predicated on stability. Well, it makes community possible because see, when we're stable, we vow stability, then we can rely on each other, which is the opposite of, unconscious blackmail. It undercuts unconscious blackmail. This is unconscious blackmail, and we do it all the time. I will be your friend, I'll be your marriage partner, or I'll join you in a religious community until you upset me, or until it gets nasty, and then I want to move away, See, then we're always somehow unsure. There isn't stability because anybody can pull away at any given time, See, so stability is, I'm going to be there, come what may. Okay. It's interesting. I don't know if you know who Jim Wallace is. Jim Wallace is an evangelical working out of Washington. And Jim's been doing major social justice work for 50 years. And he built the Sojourners community. But he's very candid about when he was a young man, he moved to Washington, and he had a lot of very idealistic young people move in and said, we're going to make a community. We're going to live together. And he said it was wonderful. And these people were very sincere. But then, not that they were fought with these, they said, all of a sudden, somebody has a baby. They said, well, our kids can't go to this school. And then people kept moving out because of the child reasons or something else. He said his community kept falling apart. Not because there wasn't goodwill, but people just kept moving out. And he realized we can't build like that. You know, if we can't build because next year you may leave. See, so it's the foundation of enduring community. It's the foundation of a marriage. It's the foundation of a family. And then it's stability, and this is an important part. It carries, absorbs, and transforms the tensions. Whoops. I touched the key by accident. It carries, absorbs, and transforms the tensions, its functions within community. You know, all communities at a certain point are dysfunctional. You know, we have all this literature on dysfunctional families, dysfunctional organizations, dysfunctional churches. And that literature is good, with this exception. That literature gives you the impression that somewhere there are perfect families and perfect churches and perfect communities and perfect marriages. There aren't any. We're humans. And in every marriage, every family, every church, every religious community, there's going to be tensions and there's going to be dysfunctions. And the task of our fidelity is to carry and absorb that and transform it so you don't give it back in kind. The image I use here, the image of, say, a water purifier. It takes in water with toxics and impurities and dirt and poisons, but it holds them inside of itself and gives you back just the pure water. James Hillman, the anthropologist, said the first function of every family is to carry the dysfunctions of that family. Okay, I'm going to double back on that at times when you don't do it. Okay, now, given that, this is the second point, all families and communities are dysfunctional and can only sustain themselves on the basis of forgiveness. So that fidelity and stability, it can only happen if we forgive each other. You know, sometimes I like using a double negative to make a point. And it's this: in every marriage, in every church, in every relationship, we cannot not disappoint and hurt each other. Anytime you're close to somebody or people for a long period of time, there's going to be times when you disappoint them. There's going to be times when they hurt you, hurt them. It's times they're going to disappoint you and you're going to disappoint them. Remember, there's a famous British writer, a wonderful novelist, Rachel Billington. And in every one of her books, she sneaks this in. And she said about marriage, she says, in marriage, the first task in every marriage is for the couple to console each other that they cannot not disappoint each other. You know, only God will never disappoint us. You know, all the rest of us, we're human. Now, I want to make a note here. You know, before I said, like, we owe it to stay with one exception. You know, there are times when we make a vow of perseverance and so on, where we need to walk away. And that is when it's abusive. See, before I said, we need to absorb normal things in life. Parents need to absorb the immaturities of their kids. Couples need to absorb some of the immaturities of the partner. You know, religious communities need to absorb the eccentricities and, you know, whatever of the personality differences. But one of the things we don't absorb is abuse. And here, you know, the churches have learned. There was an older theology where we believed, stay with the person. You know, the loving thing to do is to stay with your alcoholic husband or to stay with your abusive partner. Now we realize it's wrong, you know, because when you stay with them, you're not taking away the sin, you're enabling the sin. It's one of the great lessons we learned from 12-step programs, that sometimes when a person's abusive or addicted or whatever, the loving thing to do is to walk away, because as long as you stay, you're enabling and the behavior goes on. Okay, so we absorb the normal things in love, but we don't absorb abusiveness. Okay. Now, thirdly, I want to talk about our struggles with this. You know, today we struggle with stability, and we struggle with commitment. We struggle with fidelity. Why? A number of reasons. Okay. The first one is, and this is true, like so many young people today, or so many people, period, not just young people. I don't want to pick on young people, don't get married anymore. They say, we'll live together, and marriage is too big a step. I'm not sure I can do this. I want to keep my options open. See, then precisely there isn't ultimate stability, because either the partners can walk away, or if I belong to a religious community, say, I want to make temporary commitments. Any year I might walk away. Well, then they can't build using me. But now, why the struggle? Well, it's part of the individuality of our culture. But at a deeper level, our struggle today with commitment, particularly permanent commitment, is that this is a quote from medieval philosophy. They say, every choice is a series of renunciations. Every choice is a renunciation. Every choice is a series of renunciations. So when we choose one thing, we can't choose something else. If you marry Jack, you can't marry Peter. If you do this, you can't do the other thing. And so today, now, we like to keep our options open. And so we really struggle as a society, as a whole society. Maybe we can talk about that. And this is one of our society has many strong points. This is one of our weakest points. We really struggle with commitment because everybody wants to keep all their options open. Okay. Then secondly, we struggle with the imperfections within marriage, within family, within church and community. So for instance, I'm a Roman Catholic, and a lot of Roman Catholics have left the church because of the sexual abuse crisis, the clergy's sexual abuse crisis. I can't put up with that, and that's real. It's a terrible thing. So they say, like, or inside of communities, oftentimes we're not going to deal with imperfections, and so commitment is hard. And then lastly, this sounds maybe abstract, but it's not. You know why we struggle with commitment? Because we really over expect from other people. We and from jobs and everything else, we want them to give us what only God can give. I want to give you two quotes here, and then I'll try to tease this out. St. Augustine, this is a very famous quote. You all know it. But St. Augustine begins his confessions with this line. He said, "You've made us for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." So there's only one thing that would bring us rest, and it's God. And so very concretely, for instance, if I get married and I expect my partner is going to still all my restlessness and fulfill all my needs, then that's unfair to her. She can't do that. Only God can do that. Or a job or a family. Parents have kids, and these kids have to fulfill the parents. They can't do that. They can do some wonderful things, but nobody can be God for us. Karl Rahner, I love this quote. I've made a living using this quote and so on. He says, "In the insufficiency of everything attainable, we learn that in this life, there is no finished symphony." Now, this was a context of a letter. One time, Rahner was a Jesuit priest, and one of his Jesuit colleagues, a young man, wrote to him, and he says, "I'm a priest," and he says, "But I'm not happy. I need to leave. I need to marry," and maybe that's legitimate, and so on. But Rahner said, maybe you need to do this. He said, "But I'll give you one warning." He said, "If you enter marriage expecting it's going to be the full symphony, you're going to be, first of all, hard on your marriage partner, and you're going to be disappointed." And he coined this line. He says, "Remember," he said, "in the insufficiency of everything attainable, we learn that in this life, there is no finished symphony." Henry Nouwen used to say, in this life, he said, "There's no such a thing as a clear-cut, pure joy. Everything has a shadow. It's this, there's always a little something, but we're always, there's something inside of us that wants the full symphony. And that makes it hard for us to commit to stay with people, to stay in marriages, to stay in religious life, to stay with communities. And then lastly, stability is our greatest gift to each other in our path to unselfishness in heaven. I went to a conference some years ago by Mary Jo Letty. This is a wonderful woman in Toronto. She's the founder and runs Romero House for Refugees. And she was talking about this. She says, the greatest gift that you can offer to your family, to your church, to your community, to your marriage, whatever, say, you can rely on me. I'm going to stay here. I might not always be in harmony with you. We may have our differences. We may have our spats and so on, but I'm not going to walk away. You can rely on me. You can build on me and so on. So that is the greatest gift we can give our families. That's what couples give each other in marriage. They say, I want to be there for you, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor. And they don't say, or until something better comes along. I used to go to seminars with Michael Meade, the anthropologist, and Michael's also a great storyteller. He drums and so on, and always to get to the end of the story, he says, and then they married, he said, and they lived happily ever after, or at least till they had their first fight. And see, so that what we owe to each other is that we can live beyond our fights and so on. And it's also our path to heaven. I want to end with an image. In John's gospel, in the Gospel of John, when Jesus reinstates Peter, so, you know, Peter denied Jesus 3 times in the Passion. Then after the resurrection, he pulls Peter aside and he makes Peter 3 times confess his love. He says, Simon Peter, do you love me? He said, I do. He said, Simon Peter, do you love me? He said, at the 3rd time, he said, Peter was grieved. He said, you know everything. You know that I love you. He said, feed my sheep. But then he says this. He said, up to now, you've girded your belt and you walk where you wanted to walk. He said, now they'll put a rope around you and take you where you'd rather not go. That's exactly what commitment does. You know, when we don't commit ourselves to stability, to fidelity, and so on, we can go and walk wherever we want, but it doesn't lead us to sanctity. You know, commitments, family. I'll give you an example. Most couples, they always have this joke. I said, you know, parents don't raise children. The children raise the parents. The man and woman are pretty immature until they start having kids. And after, you know, having to respond to their needs for the next 25 years, they've grown pretty unselfish. You know, see, so that commitment, it's the rope. It's going to put a rope around you and take you where you'd rather not go. So as you can see from this, I'm going to stop to share, is that the way I define fidelity, stability is with fidelity, it's with commitment, you know, so that families, religious communities, everything is predicated on people saying, a community, a family, a marriage is stable if people say, I'm going to stay, I want to stay. If we subtly blackmail each other that I'm going to stay until it gets tough, then I'm going to go, you never have stability, you know. So it's interesting in religious communities, some communities, monastic communities, they make a vow of stability. In a lot of religious communities, we make a vow of perseverance. It's exactly the same. Perseverance is what makes for stability. So Rachel, I'm going to turn it back to you. That's my 20 minutes. And
thank you so much.
Okay.
I'd love to, I just want to show this little book again to people because it's such a treasure, especially for those of us who, you know, want to live this life, want to espouse some of these, you know, monastic points of monastic spirituality that we talk about a lot. But here we are in our houses with spouses and kids and all kinds of things going on. So anyway, I think one of the things that's so interesting to think about is like, okay, stability. So what does that mean for families? And I love in the book, you talk about, it's the example of the famous mystic, Carlo Coretto, who realized his mother's path to holiness was through years of raising children. And I think selflessness seems like something that can be impossible, especially when you're surrounded by people whose needs seem more important than yours at the moment. But I wonder if you would be willing to talk about this a little bit, just, the opportunity to become less selfish through persevering, through stability.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. Well, let me just refresh the story. I'm not sure if your viewers all know, but Carlo Creta was this famous monk. And, but also he was a pretty radical monk. Mm. He lived as a hermit in the Sahara Desert for 24 years. And he did a lot of praying. He wrote some marvelous books. He learned the Bedouin language and translated the scriptures into Bedouin and so on. And so he's out there, he's praying night and day, trying to become a holy man. And he went back to Italy to visit his mother, who had raised like 10 kids or whatever. And he said, my mother, there were some years she didn't have time to go to the bathroom. No, I don't think I'm right. He said, I found out she was more spiritual and less selfish than I was. And he said, but the conclusion you draw is not that there's something wrong with going to the desert and praying. There's something very right in giving yourself over to duty and so on. You can have maturity by conscription, and particularly a lot of mothers do. And so I love that example, and so, we used to have in Roman Catholicism, I don't know if they had it in other religions, where they said the path to holiness for married people, as opposed to what they said, was what they called your duties of state, your job, your mortgage, your kids, your marriage, and so on. They said that is your monastic cell, as I say in the book. Monks have a monastery. Well, as the book says, that's your domestic monastery. That's your domestic cell. And the famous line where they say, stay in your cell, it'll teach you all you need to know. Yeah. But it doesn't mean a room, it means your marriage. Stay in your commitments, raise your kids, do your job, pay your mortgage, and it'll lead you to sanctity.
Yeah. In one of our earlier talks this Lent, Nathan Oates commented on that exact quotation that you just mentioned, stay in your cell, it will teach you everything. And we talked a lot that week about the temptation to run away, especially in our culture. Everything is temporary, everything is escapable. Can you talk about that a little bit, Father Ron, in regards particularly to family obligations and the benefits of planting our feet in those situations?
Yeah, sadly, Rachel, we even have expressions, you hang loose, you stay cool. Does that sound like when you tease them out, those are not very good expressions. Say, yeah, I want to stay cool, I want to hang loose, which means I'm going to commit myself if I feel like it, if I don't feel like it, and so on. It's interesting, in Canada, where I'm from, we have a wonderful sociology of religion, a guy called Reginald Bibby. Has written a number of books, and he's our top sociologist of religion up there, and he's a Baptist, but he writes for all the religions. But he said one day, he says, something? He said, there's almost a perfect correlation, where people are not going to churches. There's almost a perfect correlation between how people treat their churches and how they treat their families. He said, they want them around, but not much. see, so, a Sunday thing is predicated where people would go see their family every week. Today, so it's interesting. People don't want the churches to disappear. They want them around for when they need them. But see, you buy in, you need a baptism, you need a marriage, you need a funeral or something, you phone the church. But on a normal basis, see, you don't, you take it on your conditions. When I need it, I'll come. As opposed to, see, that's not really commitment. That's hanging loose. I'll phone you if I need you. And many, there isn't a lot of anger at churches. There's just a lot more of indifference. And, I have a lot of, I shouldn't say this in case they're watching, nephews and nieces or whatever. They love religion, just don't go to church a lot. It's kind of, when it fits and, but see, that, partly, Rachel, that's the kind of I'm going to use a strong word here. It's almost the pathological individuality in our culture. We are not a communitarian culture. And where you see the difference? When you compare our, most culture to some of the immigrant cultures, Vietnamese families, where they come in and, for instance, they get married, the whole family. See, whereas we're really individualistic.
Yeah.
And the churches that work the best in North America are ethnic churches, where people have a strong sense of sociological community.
Yeah. Yeah. Father Ron, I'm thinking about, my kids are big now, but when they were small, keeping those practical commitments to actually going to church, taking the trouble to pack everything up, clean everybody up, get them dressed, looking presentable, get there. When we could do it, we did. Sometimes we just couldn't.
Yeah.
And in times like that, as a mom, as a dad, whoever the caregiver is, it's easy to feel your own sense of stability just sort of evaporating. I mean, think about the monastery where the bell rings, you go to the liturgy of the hours. The bell rings, you go to mass. Everything is so regimented. How do we do that when we're stuck at home? Or what are the ways that we can help cultivate that stability inside in order to be who we need to whoever we're caring for at the time?
I'll start with this, Rachel. Little kids are an exception. No, that's true. When you have young kids, a lot of times it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And if you go to church, you're going to come late, have to leave early, or something happens. Little kids, they're on their own program.
Yeah.
But they're not always little.
Yeah.
Once had a wonderful spiritual director, and he said, sometimes in your life, you're going to be too busy to pray. You're not going to have time to pray. He said, but that's okay, except you ask yourself, then when I do have time, do I pray?
Yeah.
After the kids are raised and so on.
Right. Right.
It's the danger is we can form bad habits, but kids they're kids. There's a wonderful image, and if you read Rachel Held Evans' book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
In her Searching for Sundays.
Yes.
But in there, she says, her and her husband, there were some Sundays when they didn't go to church, and the irony was, then we could actually celebrate Sabbath. When you go to church, you're so busy. And so when you're home, you can have breakfast in your pajamas, you can read the paper, you can actually have Sabbath by not going to church. I thought that's such an irony,
Yeah.
But, for kids and for, sick parents or something, you make an exception, and so you just look at those years of your life, and it's years, where you say, I'm going to do the best I can. Then you're Carlo Corretta's mother, those kids, they are your church, and you always try to make the effort, but when you can't get there, particularly when you're frustrated because you can't get there, that means you're really healthy. Yeah. If you say, well, thank God the kids kept me from church for another Sunday, that's not good.
Yeah, that's good. Father Ron, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about routine. Sister Antonia and I talking about our conversation tonight, she was pointing out, she wrote it to me. She said, in our culture, everything that is creative, novel, exciting is emphasized, while routine seems boring. And in the book here, you recounted a story about weekly visits to a family member in a nursing home, and not much might happen week to week. And I think she's quoting you here. Perhaps most often there will only be the sense that it was good that you were there, and that an important life-giving connection has been nurtured and sustained despite what seemingly occurred on the surface.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the value of just showing up, being there, and what that lends to our relationships with other people, but maybe also our relationship with God in prayer.
That's key. Let me start with a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran priest, was martyred by the Nazis. When he used to do a marriage for young people, he'd say this. He said, today you're in love, and you think your love will sustain your marriage, but it won't. He said, but your marriage can sustain your love. See, routine, habit, so that can sustain, that's what sustains us. It sustains our prayer and so on. So that let's move it to prayer. If, for instance, okay, you're an adult, if you say, I'm going to pray when I feel like it, you're not going to pray a lot. Okay. If you're going to say, I pray because it's not even when I don't feel like it, because it's what we do. Now, I'm going to risk saying a bad word on here, but it's colorful and it's good. I don't know if your readers have ever heard of Annie Lamott.
Yes.
Annie Lamott is this woman. She's a Presbyterian out in San Francisco. Very, very colorful, but with she packs a good wallop, you know. And someone quoted there's one bad word in there, but this is a good piece. She said she had a son, Samuel. She said, and I virtually raised this kid in church. That he gets to be 14, comes one Sunday, says, Mom, I don't want to go to church anymore. So when I said, that doesn't mean anything to me. Okay. Now, it's interesting. What does a parent say to a 14-year-old? Doesn't mean anything to me. Well, this is where the bad word comes in. So I told my son, I couldn't give a shit whether it means anything to you. I said, that's a child's answer, you know. Said, first of all, it means something to me. I'm your mother. Said, it means something to these people. They love you. Said, and it means something itself. It's like visiting your grandmother. You don't visit your grandmother just every time it means something to you. You visit her because it's your grandmother. These things mean something themselves, you know. So prayer, you know, and all of our liturgies and so on, that is ritual prayer, and the ritual holds us. You know, the Jews have some wonderful expressions. Say, for instance, Sabbath. They say, you don't keep the Sabbath keeps you. Yeah. You know, you don't keep Sunday church, it keeps you. Yeah. You know, it keeps you stable and so on. It's even good for our sanity. But the third part that's underneath that is the what's happening on the surface. The great mystic John of the Cross. And when you first read, you say, what is he driving at? And John of the Cross says, early on in your spiritual life, he said, a lot of deep things happen on the surface. So then the deeper you journey into the spiritual life, the more all the deep things happen under the surface. Now, what does he mean by that? That's where I used an example. I said, imagine this. Imagine, Rachel, your mother is in a senior's home, okay? And you're the dutiful daughter, and you're living close by, okay? So 5 nights a week after work, you drive over, spend an hour with your mother, get her settled, have her supper, and so on, leave. No, you do that year in and year out. How many times do you think you're going to have an exciting, interesting conversation with your mother? Once, twice, and the other times you talk about the weather, the local sports team, what's happening, and politics, and so on. Now, compare that. You have a sister who's conveniently living in Alaska, okay? So she comes home once a year for 3 days, and her mother have deep conversations. They're crying and hugging each other, and you want to kill them both, you know? Now, the question is that deeper than what you have? No. That's the novice weeping in prayer. You know, if she stayed home for a long time, she'd be like you. But John of the Cross would say, when your mother dies, you're going to be closer to her and know her better than anybody in the whole world. Not because you'd had a lot of deep conversations. The deep conversations, they've already been had. You're there. You know through presence. And the same with prayer. You know, in fact, that's what the Desert Fathers and stuff call centering prayer. They said at a certain point, just go and sit in church. You don't have to say anything. You're just there, you know. And I was saying, if you fall asleep, that's even better. You know, Therese of Lisieux, the little flower, somebody once asked her, said, is it wrong to fall asleep when you pray? And she said, no, absolutely not. She says, a little child is equally pleasing to her parents, awake or asleep, probably more asleep. Your mother understands you're tired, you know. See, but you're there. You know, see, because if we expect something exciting to happen all the time in church, it's not going to happen. Or even in times of our family, you know, suppose the family says, we're going to be together for 45 minutes every night, you know, no cell phones and so on. You might not have deep conversations, but and it's not always going to be exciting. People are going to be looking at the wristwatches, but you're there. You're there. It accomplishes its purpose. And so that's it. So he said, when you're a novice, when you're first starting, you come off some retreat and you're on fire, you know, some altar call. That's, you know, in scripture, they have 2 images. That's the mountain. You meet God on the mountain, but you live on the plain. You know, so see, so the mountain experience, that's real. It doesn't endure. That's not where you live.
Yeah.
No, you have some high experiences, but you live on the plane.
Yeah.
And that has to be sustained by routine, by rhythm, by ritual.
Yeah. This is a good question that just came in, Father Ron. David says, could you speak about the connection between discipline and routine?
Discipline and routine. Let me risk. I'm not sure. There's many ways you come at that. Discipline is needed for routine. First of all, the importance of thing. You know what routine gives you? It gives you precisely stability, and it gives you sanity. It anchors you. Minute to minute. What am I going to do next? What am I going to do next? I'll give you an example. Like when I was still doing a lot of counseling, and you get people who are emotionally distressed, and they're emotionally distressed, or they're suffering from an obsessional neurosis, or they lost a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and they're almost suicidal, and so on. And see, the temptation is to pull away. I remember once a young man, his girlfriend broke up with him, and he was distressed. He said, "I'm going to take my car and drive to the mountains for a week and take a cabin and think this." I said, "That'd be the stupidest thing you could do. You're going to have shooting yourself out there." So no, get into routine, go to work, stay with all your routines, let those routines hold you. See, routine keeps us sane, keeps us, and sometimes the more depressed you are or frustrated, the more it's important that you show up. And, it holds you. And that takes discipline. We mature people have enough discipline in their lives that they can do routine. They know, I don't feel like going to work today. I'm tired. I'm depressed. I'll stay home. They said, no, I'm going to work. And I'm going to do my routine. And it's the most important thing you can do. And see, because the discipline overrides the emotional feelings.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll give you another example with that. A good psychologist told me once, he said, with like depression or even clinical depression, is the greatest antidepressive drug in the whole world is physical exercise. He said it releases endorphins that there's no drug on the marketplace. But this is the catch-22. When you're depressed, you don't want to exercise. Yeah. That's the whole thing. See, so when you're tired and bored and stuff, you don't want to do the routine. But the routine is exactly what is salvific.
That's good. I wanted to ask one more question before we get to the great questions that people are submitting here. And we've talked a lot about families and young kids and that kind of thing, but I think it's also important to talk about stability in the last years of life. I think that, you mentioned in the book, how do I live the last years of my life so that when I die, my death will bless my loved ones just as my life once did? And do you have any advice for those of our listeners who might be in those later years on how to approach this time in a way that is inspiring of stability even, or life-giving to those around them?
Well, it's interesting, Rachel, God gives us a lot of help with that, and so I'll start with this. That anthropologists tell that, and everybody I've ever checked it out. Now, you're too young, you're not there. They'd say that grandparenting is the deepest joy and the purest love on the planet. They say, like in a marriage with your own kids, you're too close, there's always tension. Say with grandparenting, it's just perfect. See, so that, for instance, when you get older and a grandparent, or even if you don't have your own grandkids, at a certain point, you have a chance to bless the young. You don't have to be competitive anymore. You don't have to be jealous. You don't have to be attention. So God gives us some help. But I want to recommend a secular book. I'm actually writing a whole book on this right now, but I recommend a secular book. You can pick up any bookstore by a man called Ira Byock, Byock. And it's called The Four Things That Matter. 4 Things That Matter. And he's a medical doctor, but he works in hospice. He works with dying people. And he says, the four things that matter. He said, I always make families with the dying to them and the death. It said four things that you can work towards saying, I forgive you, forgive me, I love you, thank you. See that, or Morris West, the great Australian novelist, he published a wonderful book, an autobiography when he was 75 years old, called The View from the Ridge. But he begins this way. He says, when you get to be 75 years old, there should only be three phrases left in your vocabulary. Thank you, and thank you. And he says, you have to do inner work.
Yeah.
See, as we get older, it's not that we stop working, but you're working with a different purpose. Now your purpose is you have to try to work yourself towards gratitude, towards forgiveness, to let things go, and towards those four things that by the time you die, you're saying to everybody, I forgive you, forgive me, thank you, I love you,
Mary's just commenting. She says, the book Father Ron is talking about is a wonderful book. After reading it and crying through some parts, she gave it to a family with a family member recently diagnosed with terminal cancer. That book is truly a gift. I'll have to find it.
Ira Bayok,
okay. Father Ron, there's a few different questions about church that have come up I think might be good to talk about. Early on this evening, Jess asked, how can you have stability when you feel hurt by the church, and I believe she's saying by God, so badly that your kids are also affected? That's a hard question.
Well, no, but hard questions are legitimate questions. They're the most important questions. Let me say a few things about that. Sometimes when we're deeply, deeply hurt, and hurt by the church or hurt by life or hurt by God and so on, it's interesting, when I studied the Jewish theology and spirituality of the Sabbath, I'd never got that as a Christian, but that the theology of the Sabbath, remember to keep holy the Sabbath day. But for the Jews and observant Jews to this very day, they believe that God gave a certain rhythm of life and time that's supposed to work this way. You're supposed to work for 6 days and have 1 day of rest. Then you're supposed to work for 7 years and have 1 year of rest, sabbatical. That's where their sabbatical comes from. Then you're supposed to work for 7 times 7 years, and then you're supposed to have a jubilee year, and then you're supposed to work for a lifetime and then go on an eternity of sabbatical. The word sabbatical, which is an image for heaven. So that was the pattern. 6 days, 1 year, 1 day rest. 7 years, 1 year rest. 49 years, and Now, but that was also, and this is very, very helpful, that was also the rhythm for forgiveness. See, sometimes today's psychology is too hard on us. It's just let it go, get on with life. It doesn't work like that. See, in the Jewish, which is also the Christian spirituality, it's supposed to work like this. You can hold a little grudge for 6 days, then you have to let it go. That's how long you can pout. You can hold a major grudge for 7 years. That's where we even got lost, the statute of limitations. Okay. You can hold a soul-searing grudge for 49 years. We just can't let it go, See, because our emotions and stuff, we have to work with that, but you can't just say, well, forgive this person. It doesn't work like that. And you can hold something that just ruined your life until your deathbed, but then you have to let it go. You have to, but notice God gives us time. A mini little mosquito bite, you got 4 days. A big hurt, you have 7 years. A soul-searing hurt, you have 49 years. And something that ruined your life, you have a lifetime. But then we have to let it go. And then also the point I said earlier, with the church or in a marriage or wherever, if something is abusive, then the loving thing is not to stay. That used to be an older theology. Your spouse may be abusive, maybe alcoholic and so on, but the loving thing is you stay for better or for worse. No, we've learned today that's not the loving thing to do, because then you're actually enabling the sin, by staying, so so that don't absorb abuse from anybody, including the church.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Here's another question about church from John Paul. He's asking, well, I'll read it directly. He says, in 8 years, 72 million of us will be over 65, baby boomers with declining mobility, declining roadworthiness. If our parishes only serve those who can sit in a pew, how do we cope with parish abandonment of elders? And maybe I'll spin that a little bit, John Paul, if you don't mind, to say, then where's stability for those folks who can't find it in their parish the same way they used to, perhaps, or feel they can't contribute to it in their parish the same way they used to?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that, because I believe that most parishes and churches are actually trying to be very sensitive of that. You know, a generation ago, you know, we didn't have ramps and we didn't have things and so on. You know, today I think that the Disabilities Act and so on, like parishes, schools, public institutions are much more accommodating than they used to be. You know, it used to be, you know, for instance, the building I'm in right now, which is the oldest building on campus, our office building, was built 103 years ago. It hasn't got an elevator. It hasn't got ramps. So you can't get into it, you know. Now, fortunately, we have new buildings with them, but, you know, they just didn't do that. And churches didn't do it. But today that it's getting better. And our task is to push our parish to make sure there is a place, you know, for disability, for seniors, and so on.
Absolutely.
The scarier question, John Paul, is that I wonder in a few years how many people under 65 are still going to church. That's
very true. Here's a question, Father Ron, from Dennis. He says, can you comment on a family issue when one spouse practices stability and routine, but the other spouse is not interested?
I can comment that's a problem. That's a problem. You know, if it's on minor things where it's just an irritation, then you try to accommodate and so on. You know, sometimes you can put up with an irritation because there's so many other things. So I'm far enough away from, for instance, I live in a house with one of our priests who is sloppy. You know, he's always got dishes in the sink and there's dirt on the table and so on. And sometimes you like to strangle him, but he's a wonderful man otherwise. So that's a small thing to put up with. I'd sooner put up with somebody who's a wonderful person. And he also has some eyesight problems. He doesn't always see the mess he's making and so on. But he brings some other, see, that's just an irritation. But if it's something that's fundamentally a challenge with personalities, then I advise you should see a counselor or really try to look at that. You know, so sometimes these are little eccentricities that we can deal with. And we're temperamentally different. Some people like routine, some people like excitement, you know. And so, but if it's something that fundamentally threatens your relationship, then you need to have somebody else have a look at that.
Thank you. Father Ron, Pat is asking, has the plethora of choices created this difficulty to make commitment?
Yes, no question. You know, a priest I used to live with, a very reflective guy, and he says, you know, when you look at, you know, what's presented today, you know, in the media and so on, he said, it's a miracle anybody makes a commitment. He said, I'm not surprised that so many marriages break up. He said, I'm always surprised that some people actually make it, because there's just so much pressure and new choices and, you know, kind of like ethos pressure, you know, like, are you happy? Maybe your marriage isn't happy and so on. So there's so much pressure, conscious and unconscious. And I like what this guy said. He says, I'm amazed and grateful anybody makes it. There's just so much pressure and in everything, you know, like if you're a little older as an American, you can remember a time not that far ago, you know, back into the 60s, where in the United States you had 3 television channels. Yeah. And in fact, and they were almost all the same between ABC, NBC, and CBS. You didn't know which one you had on. Now you have hundreds of them and millions of blogs and so on, and Twitter and so on. So it's the choice, it's overkill. It's just overkill. And I'm not even sure it's good for our sanity. It certainly isn't good for community, because now nobody has the same information anymore, you know. Just as we saw with the vaccination, anti-vax thing, you know, everybody has their own research, their own labs, their own.
So true. Eileen and Lou are asking if you could please speak about giving our death away versus giving our lives away.
Okay, let's start with giving our lives away. You know, in the way I set up the spiritual life and so on, and human life, is, you know, we spend the years from puberty till you get married and if your career and so on. That's a struggle to get your life together. So the initial struggle is to get your life together. Then you marry, you have a vocation, and then you have another probably 40 or 50 years where your task now is to give your life away, you know. And Teresa of Avila has a wonderful line. She said, during those years, you know, from the time you marry till your grandparent retire and so on, the task is that this is the most important spiritual question: is how can I do this better? How can you be a better mother, a better Christian, a better, you know, how can you give more? Okay. Now, giving your death away, you know, and I'll quote Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen is the first person to kind of articulate that, although this is very strongly in scripture. But Nouwen says there comes a time that you don't stop working. But, you know, the question changes. Like right now, you're a young person. You say, how can I give myself away more deeply? The question becomes, how can I live now so when I die, my family and friends, that my death is a gift to them, you know, that they're graced. And you know where we understand that? Through Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, when you take John's gospel is different, because in John's gospel, Jesus has no humanity. He's always God. But in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you can divide all the gospels perfectly into 2 parts. And that is up until Jesus is arrested. Until Jesus is arrested, they're describing his activity. You know, he teaches, he heals people. Notice he's doing stuff. And after he's arrested, he doesn't do anything anymore. Notice everything's done to him. They tie him up, they lead him away, they scourge him. Simon the Cyrene carries his cross, and nail him till he dies. And the interesting thing is, we say we're saved more by that than what he did for us. Wow. You know, we're saved more by Jesus' passivity than his activity. No, I don't know how many of you in your different churches, how they read the gospel on Sunday. But in a Catholic church, they'll say the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew. But they, up until Holy Week, they could say the activity of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew. And then from Jesus' arrest on, they could say the passivity of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew. You know? See, and as we get older, there's going to be a lot more passivities in your life. You know, illness, sickness, letting go, being marginalized, and so on. And they have to be seen as an opportunity. The way you once gave all your activity away, now you have to give your passivity away. You know, and that can actually be the greatest gift of all. Let me give you one quick story on that. The story always illustrates. There's a Hollywood-based writer called Heather King, and in her autobiography, and today she's writing some pretty fine spiritual books, you know, but she said she had an alcoholic father, and it kind of destroyed their family. And he said, so by the time her father died, the kids couldn't stand each other and all that and scattered. Said then my mother was a saint, and she tried for years to bring us together. Thanksgiving, Christmas, get the kids together, and it never worked. And then she died. She died of cancer. Said, and during the last week of her life, she was essentially in a coma. But all the kids came to the bedside. You know something? They reconciled. You know, but you see the mystery of that? When she couldn't do anything, she was able to do what she couldn't do, what she could do. That's the same with Jesus. He came and taught for 3.5 years, and we didn't get it. They didn't get it. He died, and we got it, you know. See, so we were able to, in his passivity, you know, get something we couldn't get from his activity. So that's also true for us. You know, as we age and, you know, there's more debilitations, there's more health things and so on. And incidentally, if I can make a little plug here, that's also why we need to understand this. Whenever we talk about euthanasia, we're not getting this. You know, see, like, you know, why should this person be alive? They can't give anything anymore. Well, maybe it's the most important time of their whole life, you know. So in any culture that talks of euthanasia doesn't get this. So we're not getting the mystery we're going to celebrate in a couple of weeks of Christ's Paschal mystery, you know.
Thank you so much, Father Ron. It's amazing how fast this hour goes by. So thank you to all of you. Kathleen mentions her church congregation is experiencing a lot of turmoil, and this presentation will help her persevere through Holy Week and Easter. I'm so glad. Thanks, Kathleen. Jessica says, thank you. There are more questions in, and I'm so sorry we've come to the end of our hour, but obviously lots to talk about. And I pray that you can each find ways in your own situations to keep talking about these things and encouraging one another in all the ways the Holy Spirit leads us to keep stability with God, with each other, in our churches and our families. Thank you, Father Ron. I'm just going to give a quick reminder to everyone that if you want to acquire any of the resources from these talks over the past few weeks, including Father Ron's Domestic Monastery and his other books, go to your local bookstore, go to any retailer you're comfortable with. If you visit paracletepress.com, you can use a coupon code STABILITY and you'll get a 20% discount, especially for those of you who might be looking for resources to use with your Bible study or your small group or your church group. We hope you'll take advantage of that. Thank you to all of you who have made this Lenten series part of your Lenten observance. We're so grateful to have been able to spend the time with you. Thank you again to Father Ron, and our prayers with all of you in these last few days of Lent and Holy Week leading up to Easter. Yes, for those of you asking, you'll get a link so that you can watch this again. Again, please share it with your friends, your family, church members, whoever you would like. And we'll also, I'll try to get a list to everyone of all the books that Father Ron mentioned tonight. Lots of questions about those. So thanks again. I pray you have a blessed evening. Thank you again, Father Ron. We're so grateful to you.
Thank you, Rachel. And say hello to your whole community there, okay?
I sure will. Thanks, Father Ron.
Okay. Okay, bye
Good
then.
night.
Bye.